David, this week we've been offering a little bit of a unique approach to some of our sponsor-only exclusive programs. How are you this morning, David?
I'm very well, Jason. Good to be with you.
It's good to be with you, David. And normally I think our regular viewers are well aware that Discovery CSI, David Hawkins' Discovery CSI, is normally available only to Patreon and Subscribestar sponsors who join us by going to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. What we wanted to do, David, since it's still the first week of September, was to introduce a wider audience to the show that you and I have developed and allow them an opportunity to join us as sponsors for future episodes and to catch up on all the previous episodes that we've done. And the thing that is really becoming more and more apparent each week, David, is that these hypotheses, these theories, the concepts that you've been sharing for more than a decade, first with your work on Able Danger, and now here on Discovery CSI, David Hawkins' Discovery CSI on Crowdsource the Truth, you've spoken about topics that are of great interest, including surveillance, 9/11, the control of the patent office by the company Serco, and the role of this man, Nicholas Soames, and his brother Rupert Soames in what appears to be a supranational fraternal network of government bureaucrats that survive elections, presidents, prime ministers, and whatever else to execute their own agenda. And of course, Mr. Soames is famous to our audience as the Mendenhaller in chief. Do we want to do a brief recap of what this Mendenhalling is all about and why it's important with all this new attention on public steganography in fake news publications?
Yes, absolutely. And just to remind people that Nicholas Soames and Rupert Soames are grandsons of Winston Churchill. So they're born into very powerful, globally influential families. And they've played those cards to the max. And if I use the phrase playing cards, both of these men are members of White's Club, which is the famous aristocrats gambling club where they gamble on a whole variety of things, including back in, I think, the 18th century, whether or not one lord could make love to a woman in a hot air balloon 1,000 feet above the earth. And I don't know how challenging that is and who won or who lost, but I always like the idea of, there are so many things that you can digress. My study of thermodynamics tells me it's the science of hot air, waste, and chaos, which is a great metaphor for politics, but I digress. Yeah, so Nicholas Soames occurred to me, at least in my imagination, as a possible candidate as the father of Mendenhall's baby. Now, Mendenhall's baby was a weird phrase that occurred in an article, yeah, you've got it, back in 1979, where this woman, Christine Marcy, who's the sister of my former colleague at Able Danger, Phil McConnell, appears to have had a Mendenhall's baby. And that struck me as odd because I'd never heard the term Mendenhall before, but eventually I found a definition that I find quite amusing in an urban dictionary, and maybe you could pick up the story from there.
Well, it's actually quite important, this story, David, because it starts off seeming as a salacious or even ridiculous thing, but this Mendenhall term, as defined by the Urban Dictionary, which is not exactly Oxford's English dictionary, but you and I did not put this here, somebody put this here, and it defines Mendenhall as the act of mounting someone from behind while they are in the fetal position on the ground. After the deed is complete, you roll them over and see the humiliation in their eyes. This is best accomplished in front of a large audience. Now, we don't really know who put this there. there is no, rock solid official definition of Mendenhalling, but that seems like it could be a definition. And what you have alleged is that there exists a supranational fraternal order. And what we're looking at now, David, is the WashingtonPost.com version of this article by Judy Mann, written in 1979. I'm really so sad that Ms. Mann is no longer alive, because we could ask her, but we can see that the date in the URL here is March 25th, 2019. It was on this date that social engineers contacted the Washington Post and changed certain typos. This used to say Christine Mary, and it also said she had her first chili. Now, you and I have proposed that these typos were introduced by optical character recognition errors, and that when the article was scanned from the photographic reproductions of the original 1979 print, it resulted in errors in the online version. Now, the social engineer that contacted the Washington Post to make this change also cleverly advised them that they had another typo and that there was not a person named Mendenhall involved, but rather it was Marcy's baby that was due in early August. Now, the strange thing is, when I contacted the Washington Post to alert them that an error had actually been introduced, and I even presented them with a photographic reproduction from the New York Public Library. This is the official, this is a photograph of the Washington Post as it was printed there on August 8th, I believe, in 1979. And it clearly says Mendenhall's baby, but through a really lengthy exchange, phone calls, emails, contact to the legal department at the Washington Post, they have refused to change this article back to Mendenhall's baby. So, David, I believe, and with your help, we've come to this conclusion, that this is a steganographic message that was placed in the Washington Post in 1979 to ostensibly tell this network around the world that Christine Marcy is in. She's been indoctrinated into our fraternity.
Yeah, I mean, it's a deep penetration, pun intended, operation on the senior bureaucrats in the American government, who I believe now are targets, or have been since 1978, or even earlier, maybe back to the Second World War, for different varieties of entrapment, sexual entrapment, and blackmail, to the point now where I believe almost all citizens of the Five Eyes countries, just take going back to the Second World War, Signals Intelligence Group, the New Zealand, Australia, United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States, can no longer rely on the integrity of their public servants.
Right.
Not because necessarily the public servants are corrupt, but we're all, I believe, vulnerable to various forms of entrapment, particularly when it becomes associated with sex. And so now, if there was a Mendenhall's baby, it would be Jessica Marcy, right, which is Phil McConnell's niece. And you've done, I believe, or you have available, some extraordinary facial transformations, and I'll come to that in a minute, which suggest that her father might be the Mendenhaller in chief.
Right.
And if you're able to do that morphing.
Right. And just to address this briefly, sorry, David, just to address this briefly, we certainly do not mean to antagonize or in any way cause harm to Ms. Marcy, but this is an important matter. If there are bureaucrats around the world that are behaving in this way and compromising people in this way, I think it's important that we know. This is obviously would be an emotional issue for anyone to find out that someone is their parent who they don't expect to be. But we created this, as I said, not to antagonize her, but to do a forensic analysis and examine this hypothesis. I think that the facial similarities between these two individuals are highly suggestive that your theory may be correct.
And of course, it leads down a rat hole, if that's the right term, of the potential use of face recognition software to frame innocent people, populate a database, which might be the Internet Movie Database owned by Amazon since 1998, or the Child Base, which has been developed by an outfit up here in Vancouver called Imagist Technologies in a joint venture with Serco and the National Crime Squad.
Right.
Because what appears to have happened, and it coincides with an extraordinary pair of raids in August of 1999 in Vancouver and in Texas. The raid in Vancouver, as you know, you came up, and I think we did wonderful documentaries. We took a trip out to Dominion Road. We didn't get to see the place where Piggy Palace held its raves with 1,700 people, but going back to that Urban Dictionary definition, it would be quite impressive if someone of high status, male or female, was Mendenhalled in front of a large audience and rolled over to see the humiliation in his or her eyes. And possibly not in front of a large audience, but in a torture studio, either in 425 Carroll Street, which apparently was into recording hardcore adult and child pornography at the time of the raid, and had an online gambling service in 66 countries. Now, so that was August of 1999, and then it turns out in August of 1999, this outfit, Landslide Productions, was raided in Texas. And again, all of the kit, presumably the images, the databases, the content, was taken from what appears to have been a crime scene. Now, my question and your question, and we don't have an answer from that, but one day we'll get the FBI to do its job, or maybe even the National Crime Squad to do its job, and find out where that content went. Because it was taken away from the crime scene, and spoliation is a felony, punishable in the United States, I think, as a felony, or maybe 5 years in jail.
Is it?
We are entitled to an aggressive inference of guilt. I'm sorry?
I didn't realize that spoliation of evidence was a felony. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and so we're entitled to speculate or make an aggressive inference of guilt when people take evidence away from a crime scene, that they lose the presumption of innocence until they answer or can answer the question, where did they take the information? Well, I think they took it, and this is my speculation, and they installed it or integrated it with the Internet Movie Database, which had been acquired by Amazon the year before, 1998. Right? And so you've got a collection of images, I think their terminology, a gallery of images, if you will, that shows sickening abuse of children by possibly or probably some very influential people around the world. And again, then we come to Jeffrey Epstein, who appears on the front page of your collage for today's show. Well, Jeffrey Epstein was flying around the world with this Boeing 727. Allegedly, it had a Lolita bed. He has in his safe, he had a whole stash of diamonds, which could be blood diamonds. And as far as I can see, he was the American equivalent of Jimmy Savile.
Right.
And they are both pedophile blackmailers, which is pretty extraordinary because Jimmy Savile had penetrated, again, pun intended, deep inside the BBC, which is supposed to be a premier news organ around the world, but I think it's the... I'm sorry?
And the royal family.
Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Well, exactly. So you got potentially... I can hear you. Are you okay?
I'm well. We just have a bit of a delay, it seems. I was just saying that he's penetrated into the royal family, and it's not happenstance. They've known each other for some time, it seems. There he is with Diana.
Princess Diana is killed or has her initial set of injuries in the road tunnel under the Pont d'Arme Bridge, which I used to commute through when I was living in Paris. And the closed-circuit television cameras are switched off. Jeffrey Epstein allegedly dies of suicide in his cell in that Manhattan Correction Center. And the cameras, as far as I know, there's no recording of the people who went into or out of his cell, notwithstanding that it had been occupied, or he shared the cell with some muscle-bound cop or ex-cop that had been charged with 4 murders that could basically rip your hyoid bone into 3 or 4 pieces with one hand. And this guy in the cell, as far as I know, this is where they play with fake news and real news, he was allowed to use his cell phone, or his Wi-Fi or whatever it was. The
now,
guards
David,
were asleep.
let me interject right
the
there.
stuff. It's manifestly for me.
It's manifestly for you, yes?
It's manifestly for me. It's a contract hit. Over to you.
Now, the thing I wanted to interject is that today in the New York Post, there was an article about cell phone in the jail. There's actually quite a long history of, let's see if we can find this easily here. NewYorkPost.com had a story that was saying that multiple prisoners in that jail have been allowed to get cell phones, and that there are sort of a long history of, it's going to be hard to find this, I didn't have it prepared, but there's a long history in that jail of contraband being provided to prisoners, to the extent that a former inspector general questioned why Epstein would be there at all. Now, you've raised a number of points there that I think are related, and I want to lay this out for people. We've spoken about steganographic messaging in newspapers. The Mendenhaller's baby is one instance of that. We've also spoken about, not on this show with you, but we've spoken about steganographic messaging in the New York Post article about Ghislaine Maxwell at the In-N-Out hamburger restaurant, and it seems that that was an extremely sophisticated steganographic sort of coded message campaign that they now seem to be in a mode of covering up. So you mentioned the similarities between the death of Diana, no cameras. You mentioned no cameras on Jeffrey Epstein. I haven't publicly revealed this before right now, but I had a conversation with the public information officer for the Department of Justice here in the Southern District of New York 2 days ago, and he could not confirm that the cameras were non-functional and that the footage was unusable. That was one of the only questions to which he provided an answer that differed from no comment. So I found that interesting. I don't know that we can take that to mean that there is in fact footage, but it is interesting to note that Larry Salona of the New York Post reported that he was the guy to report that the cameras were broken. So he was the first one to put it out. He's written another article here saying that the cameras were sent to the FBI for analysis. I mean, we're basically asking one element of the Department of Justice to determine why another element of the Department of Justice failed. But this guy, Larry Salona, was the first one to put out the story about the cameras in the jail cell being non-functional. Could be fake news.
Yeah, so what we got, and if I could pick up on that question you had, where I had taken a definition of playlists from Wikipedia, which I found eminently satisfying. You were kind enough to refer to that list of YouTubes that you and I have done as playlists, and I've got that on my website, so people can click on that and they can look at yours and my deliberation going back probably over a year. I think there's about 70 playlists there. And
well, sorry, let me correct you there,
but
David.
I'm always wary
it's one playlist with 70 videos in it. That's where the confusion was coming for me.
Ah, okay. Okay, no, and I'm not pointing the finger at you. I'm just saying what my understanding of this was. And then I found, or looked up playlist in Wikipedia, and there's multiple uses of that word in different disciplines. But what I found particularly intriguing is the news coming over the media, where they mix real-time news, right? Let's say potentially of a plane flying into the north face or the south face of the tower, with pre-recorded bank of video, and the pre-recorded stuff is referred to in this particular definition as a playlist. Yeah, let's just scroll up there. Anyway, and what that means is a big media outlet, which I would call the BBC or Amazon, I guess, could have a whole bunch of images in a gallery, maybe images of children being abused, or images of the people doing the abuse, or even Photoshop images, which may come about, let me see if I've got this right, where you can take a child who's been abused in a hotel room and fade out the criminal that's been abusing her and fade in the image of someone whose credit card has been stolen and put them all together so it looks like an innocent suspect with a stolen credit card has actually been abusing a child. And maybe an expert eye like yours can look at that picture and realize there are different elements and different dates, but the average person could look at that and say, oh, this is a pedophile. Now, that raid on Landslide in August of 1999, that turned into major investigation of pedophile news groups, if that's the right word, around the world, including the extraordinary story of Operation ORE, O-R-E, and associated with that was many, many people where the FBI is handing over a list of names to, I guess, the National Crime Squad in the United Kingdom. And as a result of that, I believe there were 33 suicides.
Ooh, you're right. Oh my God, 33 suicides, David.
This mesh.
Now, wait a minute. Let me stop you there. So we're talking about steganography.
That intrigues you, doesn't it?
It is. 33 suicides. I want to point something else out to you, David. In this article in People magazine, all about this landslide issue, which came out just 2 weeks before September 11th, 2001, there are a number of instances of 33s showing up. And we can see that this guy was given 1,335-year prison sentence. His wife is 33. So, I mean, are these coincidences? The number of times that 33s show up in stories that I feel they're being used as steganographic markers to let people know that something about this story is under control.
You're absolutely right. I think there are no coincidences. And in that documentary about the 911 hotel, there's some guy whose name I forget, who flies into New York, checks into the 911 hotel, which is the Marriott Hotel at the foot of the World Trade Center, 2 days before, and ostensibly is doing research into a book that he's gone to write about a major terrorist attack on New York. And he says, when he's interviewed, the story of the Marriott Hotel is a series of ironic coincidences, if you believe in coincidences. Well, whoever he is, I don't believe in coincidences. Right. I'm not sure you believe in coincidences.
I don't.
There's nothing coincidental about the attack of 911. And then let me, if I may, introduce this term, let me introduce the term ghost, if I may, which is an acronym. What I believe is these hotels, which are connected quite often and more frequently by fiber optics, that is to say, privileged guests in these international hotels, including the Trump Turnberry Hotel in Scotland, can communicate, I believe, in a global network that is a metaphor for the old red line, or the all red line that started to be laid in 1848 with a subsea cable link between Ireland and Newfoundland. The modern red line, for me, are fiber optic links, where the strands, the bulk of the strands, are dark fiber, because the bandwidth of each strand, and I think there can be 100 strands in a cable, has got such a huge amount that it's very hard to fill it. But you can actually rent or own some of these strands. So a group of privileged insiders, if they're bonded together by something like having their images in a gallery associated with the abuse and even the torture killing of children, means I would suggest that those very important people have no life or volition of their own. They're not independent anymore. They're total and complete puppets. Now, Whether that applies to some of the most famous people that we like to talk about, like Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton. Allegedly, she took 6 trips on that Lolita Express, and she has, I think that the term is she sweeps both sides of the street, but I don't know if that means anything to an American audience.
Yeah.
And Bill Clinton traveled on that plane 26 times. Apparently now it's coming out, and we've shown pictures of that. There was a dentist chair in one of the chalet bathrooms on Epstein's Island. And apparently I saw in one of the rag magazines at the Save On today, where I went for a coffee before the show, this was for naughty girls, right? Well, this comes to mind, like the boys from Brazil, or you've got some extraordinary story of a young girl, perhaps in a dentist chair, having her teeth drilled by some sick pervert who gets their thrills from doing that to little girls. I mean, what I'm saying is the Epstein empire is global.
Yeah.
The Jimmy Savile empire is global. Behind those 2 pedophile entrapment specialists is a high technology network which can transmit real-time images of the killing of another human being. For all I know, there was a cell phone inside Epstein's cell, possibly wielded by the guy who could snap your hyoid bone with one hand, recording a real-time snuff film to be transmitted to elite insiders to warn them this is what happened if you blow the whistle on the crown jewels, which is a gallery of images of children being abused in the company of their abusers, in the custody of Amazon and Serco. Now, why do I put those 2 companies together? The top 10 shareholders of Amazon, which include, for example, Northern Trust of Chicago, which was the alien property custodian in World War I and World War II, and we can come to that if viewers wish. The top 10 institutional shareholders of Amazon are all shareholders in Serco. I think that top 10 is the controlling shareholders of Amazon and Serco, and to all intents and purposes, Amazon is Serco and Serco is Amazon. Does that seem plausible?
It does, David, and I've found the article I was talking about earlier from the New York Post, which describes how the MCC had egregious security breaches in its history. This article talks about how Paul Sperry interviewed an individual who, let's see, what does it say? Security breaches are often. Patrick Dunleavy is a former Deputy Inspector General for the New York State Department of Corrections. And he talks about how terrorist suspects were allowed to have laptops and cell phones and things that allowed them to transmit and conceal classified information. This individual is Huma Abedin's cousin who was in there. Talks about cellmates. This guy was a tech entrepreneur who was a owner in the studio behind the Twilight movies. So again, this nexus of media and finance and corporations and government individuals and all these people that seem to be able to break the law and not go to jail, it's an interesting thing. Now, I spoke to another NYPD source about my frustration with the lack of information coming from the public information officer for the Department of Justice. And this NYPD source, who spoke anonymously, he wasn't a public information officer and couldn't go on the record, but he said that he felt that this all indicates that there's an ongoing investigation, and that is why the PIO couldn't share this information with me. I might feel more, comforted by that statement if it wasn't for the fact that every single thing about the investigation and incarceration of Jeffrey Epstein up to this point has been a total disaster. Right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Now, I get the impression that our listeners, perhaps the people who study what I talk about, they feel they go into a technical well and they can't get out. And I understand that and I sympathize with it. The problem is I have a brain that actually flourishes down at the bottom of a technical well. And for example, I find reading patents fascinating, because I like to think of, I see flesh and blood. Behind every patent there are some human beings. And I'm always, having applied for a couple myself in the 1980s in the area of artificial intelligence, I always instinctively empathize with people who have bright ideas and struggle to get them realized and possibly exploited. So when I see this technology described in the patent, asymmetric encryption that was assigned to the Boeing company in the 4th of May of 2001, and I look into that, and it's a very technical language, but what intrigues me enormously is someone like Mr. Swigart, Dave Swigart, a self-described ethical hacker and the owner of probably a beleaguered pussycat called Prepper Kitty, right?
Yeah.
And I was thinking that perhaps we could start a little adoption fund and take Prepper Kitty away from this appalling individual.
No.
And so it could have a proper life, but I
think
digress.
you let him keep the cat. We're not doing anything to the cat.
All right, okay. But anyway, he describes himself as an ethical hacker. And I suggest, because he spends a lot of time on you and me about our shortcomings in life, he applies his knowledge as an ethical hacker to look at this asymmetric encryption pattern and tell us, or tell the American public, is it possible that you could hack into an aircraft where the body of the text, which might be Betty Ong's messaging during the hijacking events, could be encrypted, but the header or router information could bounce the message off a plane that they want you to believe was hijacked, right? So the message goes up to the plane, let's say it's American 175 or American 77, and then inside the plane, the body of the message is unscrambled and then transmitted back from the plane to a ground station. So we get the impression that there's a woman describing a hijacking in the plane, when in fact that woman may be dead, or it could be pre-recorded, or she could be anywhere else in, let's say, a hotel, and she believes she's participating in an exercise, right? But the public gets the impression that she's been hijacked. Now, this is a horror story because, of course, and that comes back to this term that I've sort of borrowed from the way the industry uses it, which is a fake news playlist. Right. Now, the term in the patent application that we've looked at for social networking is artificial reality messaging.
Well, we've had a couple of
patents, and I've shortened that up into ARMADA.
David, you've had a couple of patents that deal with this. Well, you've pointed out several patents that I think are these, you call them patent pools, the clipping the patents together. But one of the most important ones I think that you've spoken about historically is this social engineering protection appliance, and how this might be utilized to identify the things that you and I are talking about and send social engineers to counteract what we're talking about.
You're absolutely right, and it's exceedingly difficult for you and for me to fight off these social engineers, because they accuse us of, I don't know, fake science and fake news, but they offer nothing, right? But that's not their job. Their job is to divert and distract and decoy, and basically take people like us and other people who maybe meet a fate like Michael Hastings or whatever, take us out of the public consciousness, if you will. So we are pushed down and down and down in terms of hit rates, and the public never gets to see, and first of all, it's very difficult to get this message in a form that the average member of the public who's got other things to worry about, debts, bills, etc., and a day job, can understand. So I think it's very important if we can exploit their terminology, and that's the beauty of going into the patent office. For example, that one about using artificial reality messaging to create and share content on a social network, for me is the meta patent of all meta patents, because there it's basically the toolkit or the blueprint for planting fake news playlists into the public consciousness. And they play over and over again that part of reality that they want you to believe in, but is fake, and they decrease the amount of time or airtime to the most important real part of the crime scene, which, for example, is the line of people on the Pentagon lawn, probably 10 to 15 minutes after impact of whatever it was that hit the Pentagon. And these people are being instructed by someone with some earphones to pick up little bits of evidence on the Pentagon lawn and pop it into a brown paper bag and take it away. And that, for me, is spoliation, entitling the American public at large to make an aggressive inference of guilt that the people taking away evidence from the crime scene are in some way associated with that crime scene.
Not only that,
in my
David,
case, and that clown who did the article.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, the clown who did the article, what? Well,
that clown who did that video that you just sent me, I think yesterday.
Yes, we don't even need to talk about
where
that.
He talks about me and fake. Well, actually, we do and we don't, you see, because he would be one example of the social network which pops up to undermine a brutally frank, cynical, if you will, reality analysis of what happened at that crime scene. There you can see unambiguously someone with an FBI T-shirt. Now, are they FBI? It's very clear that you could identify with this face recognition software developed in Vancouver whether that guy has ever appeared on one of those hardcore child and adult pornography transmissions from Starnet. What I'm saying is I believe there is a whole network of people with various degrees of culpability that have got caught up in this international global network of entrapped and blackmailed pedophiles who, when they're told to do something, they do it, no questions asked, without necessarily, from a compartmentalizing point of view, understanding what the hell they do. I would predict that when we find out who that guy is, that he checked into the Pentagon City Sheraton Hotel the night before, and he was given a briefing with his fellow environmental cleaners, which is one of the worshipful companies of the City of London. And I think he would have been told, you go onto the Pentagon lawn, be there at, let's say, 9:30. There'll be some whiz-bang effects associated with an exercise, and you'll be told to go into and pick up evidence, pop it in a brown paper bag, and for all I know, fly out of Washington a little later that day and back to, well, why not British Columbia, and check into the Matsqui jail near Abbotsford Airport for dinner. And he's got a perfect alibi. Who is that guy?
Well, David, let me point out something else.
Isn't that a great line in Butch Cassidy and the Dance Killer?
Yeah, we don't want people to go pursuing FBI agents, but it is an interesting question who this guy is. I want to point out something else that you and I have looked at this photo at least dozens of times, if not more. I want to point out something quite interesting that has just occurred to me. Again, I've become very focused on this idea of steganographic messaging, fake news messaging, photo manipulation. It's a artificial reality that they are creating through these messages. So this is one of the highest resolution and clearest photographs we have ever been able to download of anything having to do with September 11th. And you can see quite a lot of detail. You can see the rivets on this section of what is conceivably an airplane. There's a small part, but this guy is holding it in such a way that it is very apparent that this is a piece of an American Airlines jet. American Airlines at some time in, I think, the 1990s made the decision to not paint the majority of the body of their jet. We can see that this is bare aluminum with what looks like a piece of an American Airlines logo on it. They did that to save weight by not having all these cans of paint dried on the jet. The jet was lighter. So this is immediately identifiable. This looks like a section of an A. This over here looks like a section of a C on this piece. Whoops, sorry. This piece against the wall over here. So right away, this sends the message, they're picking up pieces of an American Airlines jet. However, the question is, where's the hole? The hole is somewhere over here to the right. How did this piece of the jet get over here unless somebody picked it up, and placed it there. You're trying to tell me an explosion of a jet put this piece of the fuselage right here in the corner, and this just looks like a piece of garbage that somebody threw down there. How is this any kind of organized way to collect evidence? It seems like a pile of prop evidence that can be picked up and photographed by these people to appear in a very high resolution photograph that can be used in furtherance of the lie that a American Airlines jet hit the building. What do you think of that, David?
Yeah, absolutely. So this comes back to, the way I use now this term fake news playlists, right? There are stuff that can be replayed from a YouTube archive, if you will, again and again. There's other stuff that is not replayed. So there are very few YouTubes that are showing these people moving across the Pentagon lawn, because I think, if you will, it's kind of convoluted. This is reality, artificial reality. This is a real image of an artificial reality staging, right? Which is an exercise, components of an exercise. My argument is, and incidentally, people should know that that's I believe, a helicopter control tower in the background, that cab, as they call it, sort of overlooking the, I think there's a mark on the Pentagon lawn with H, so that people arriving at the Pentagon flying by helicopter. And I just want to remind people that Ghislaine Maxwell is a helicopter pilot, right? Which is kind of useful. And she liked to be a helicopter pilot and fly young girls around for the delectation of Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, the woman is a psychopath, right? She said, because then people won't know where we are, because she's a private pilot. But interestingly, the world's largest non-state air traffic controller is Serco. Mm-hmm. Right? And Serco had 50 or 60 FAA contract towers around North America on 911 that would have been in a position, Swigart, wake up, take your head out from where the sun doesn't shine, and look at the possibility that Serco's FAA contract towers were used in this asymmetric encryption to communicate with planes that they wanted you to think were hijacked, where they could impute a voice conversation from someone who's actually on the ground into the plane and get it back from the plane. So the public starts to thinking that Betty Ong, that stewardess, was talking about a real hijack where she's there, but she could be anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
Just like Bill Clinton could be anywhere, and he happens to be. And this is very important for those images of the date and timestamp outside the Pentagon, where we got the 12th of September, or September the 12th, 2001, 1737-19. Well, 12th of September 2001 is the date in a hotel in Queensland where Bill Clinton was staying, right? 1737-19 is the time in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates where the muscle hijackers allegedly got their visas from the operator of the National Visa Center in the United States, an outfit by the name of Serco. So Serco / Amazon has completely penetrated the news medium and story of the United States, going back to probably, in my opinion, the bombing of the East African embassies in 1998. Over to you.
Now, David, the last time you mentioned that Amazon controls Serco, I did a search for those two terms, Amazon.
I'm sorry, may I interrupt that?
Yes.
Other way around.
Serco controls Amazon, my bad.
Serco controls Amazon.
Right. So I did a search for Serco Amazon, and it resulted in us, there we go, there it is. Very strange that searching for it on Amazon, yeah, it's really difficult to find. I don't know how I even found it. It's bringing up coffee mugs, which upset Mr. Swigart quite a lot. There was, here, Serco International, where is here it is, okay. So searching for Serco on Amazon.com seems unable to find this, but we were able to find this book for $99. I feel like it was more money the last time we looked at it, but certainly would discourage people from buying it, I think. And David, the good and interesting news is that I have actually obtained a copy of the book. I have it here. And we can read this and learn some more about Serco. Now, it's interesting to note that this book is titled Serco, A Family History, 1929 to 1999. And it talks about how Serco went from being RCA, the British version of RCA, RCAGB 1929, to becoming Serco. And you've told us about quite a lot of this. The interesting thing is this book is actually written by Serco.
Or was it the chairman of Serco that wrote it?
Well, the foreword is written by Richard White, the executive chairman, on 6 May 2002. And he says, as this book was being written, a lengthy debate took place in true Serco fashion between those who were passionate about bringing the Serco history alive with personal tales and anecdotes, and those who felt that this was a company that had attracted such dedication from its employees that it would be an anathema to mention the names of only a few people when the company's success was the result of so many, and that is a huge run-on sentence.
I'm good at those.
Yeah.
Right. But let's just go back now. So I noticed the sort of the faded out RCA logo on the cover of that book.
Yes.
And of course, that's the same logo that we see on the proximity fuse.
Yep.
That was developed by the British. The technology was transferred in the Tizard mission to the United States in 1940, I believe. And the deal was that the American and the British patent offices would start sharing these technologies, and where the production capability of the Brits was being degraded by the Luftwaffe bombing, the production could be built up in the United States, but both patent offices could use what the other had issued. So yeah, there's a perfect example. Now the proximity fuse, some people say that's one of the principal technologies that won the war, because with the proximity fuse, you only had to get your ground-to-air aircraft shell, anti-aircraft shell within, let's say, 7 feet or 10 feet of the target, and then the proximity devices would measure the gap and explode butterfly shrapnel in a radius, at right angles to the path taken by the projectile, and basically improve dramatically, I think by a factor of 7, the hit rate of the anti-aircraft munition. Now, very interestingly, if you look at MH17 that crashed near in East Ukraine, near a place called Donetsk, that's obviously been hit by a proximity fused shell.
Why, obviously?
Right, now that's very interesting because, sorry?
Why, obviously? How can you make that determination that it's obvious?
Well, if you just pull up a picture of MH17 and put, I don't know, proximity fuse or shell or something like that, you'll see the damage, and it's been analyzed by people more expert.
I thought they never
myself,
found it, though.
that the damage is totally consistent. Found what?
MH17. Oh, that's MH70.
No, MH370.
Right.
370 is the one that disappeared, and I believe it was tracked by thin thread data of the type developed by Bill Binney and his colleagues at National Security Agency, and I believe subverted or suborned, or whatever the right word is, by Maureen Baginski, and transferred into this network of international blackmail pedophiles, right? Who could then use it against the United States, as opposed to... I'm sorry?
I never saw these photos before, David. Very graphic, dead bodies.
Well, that's true, but if you look at the fuselage, if you Google for proximity fuse, you should come up with something that's pretty unambiguous, even if we're not experts in analyzing the debris from a plane. What I'm getting at is that they seem to have the ability to synchronize a high-value target hit, and that's one of the things that I hope we can develop during this month for our subscribers only people, is the three individuals that I believe, if we can solve those crimes or help the public understand how those people might have died, will open up the entire 9/11 conspiracy and bring the whole edifice crashing to the ground. So let me identify the three individuals that I believe we could, on our Friday shows for the rest of this month, focus upon. One is Peter James Gansey Jr., the fire chief of the fire department of New York, who was called in after the first attack on the north face of the North Tower. He arrives in Manhattan, as I understand it, and he sets up an initial command center by the South Tower, right? The South Tower falls on him. Now, I don't understand the difference between artificial reality and real reality for this guy, but it is said he dug himself out from the South Tower collapse, and then he went to the North Tower. Now, remember, the North Tower was hit first and the South Tower was hit second, and the South Tower collapsed first and the North Tower collapsed some minutes later. As a fire chief, what he would have wanted to do was to get every one of his men and women, I don't know what the mix was, out of the North Tower, because he'd realized that the people, his people in the South Tower, had been ambushed. Ambushed in the sense that their radios were jammed so that they couldn't get the signal to evacuate. So he was on the Motorola radio, right, to Rudy Giuliani, the mayor of the city. Now, and then he was killed in the North Tower collapse. Now, that's interesting, because I imagine a conversation between him and Rudy Giuliani saying, what the hell is your emergency operating center doing while my men are dying? Does that seem plausible? Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, David. We've had some people in the chat asking if we know what frequency the radios were operating at. I certainly don't know. We also have a person with us in the chat, David, who had a friend on MH17. So I apologize I had no idea there even were photos of victims like that at that. I haven't followed that MH70, MH17 as closely as you and your former colleagues did, but my memory is jogged in that the official story is that Ukrainian missiles shot it down, or Russian missiles shot it down. So there would obviously be explosive debris and potential use of a proximity fuse. I guess probably everybody has access to a proximity fuse these days, right? I mean, every government and military. Right? David? Have I got you? Can you hear me? David, I think we lost you. Can you hear me? So David's in a new location today, and we're just working on some technical issues. Can you hear me, David? I think you cannot hear me. Let's see what we can do about recovering this. Stand by, please, everyone. David, let's see what we've got here. I've lost you, David. So it looks like your microphone is muted, David. David, can you hear me? Your microphone is muted. Microphone. Your microphone. Mute. Unmute. Can't hear you. Let's just send David a chat message. Let's see. I wish I could control the mute on the mic, but I cannot. It must have just accidentally hit mute. Let's see. Have we got you, David? Got mute on the microphone. So we're going to continue with our discussion as soon as we can get this technical issue resolved. It's just a quick tap of the button. It's interesting to bring these theories together. We're less than a week away, obviously, from the 18th anniversary of the attacks of September 11th. So it's important to think about how these technologies interrelate. Okay, perhaps David will now rejoin the video chat, and that might address the problem from earlier. Let's see if we can get him in here. Well, okay, we're going to get David back in a minute. Okay, there we go. David, are you back with us? Connecting. Okay. Can you hear me now, David?
Yes, I don't know. I don't know what happened there.
No problem. So let's just carry on where you left off.
Okay, so I was talking about the proximity fuse and the attack on MH17, which crashed. It deviated from its waypoints west of Ukraine and went into a combat or disputed zone where all the previous flights of that number, the 10 previous flights, had gone south of Ukraine. When it came down near Donetsk, this was in disputed territory, the rebel commander arrived at that scene, the crime scene, and these aren't, I want to emphasize to Americans, in fact people generally, these aren't terrorist scenes, Jason, they're crime scenes, and they should be treated as such, right? When the rebel commander arrived at the crime scene, he said the bodies were rotten, right? That is to say, these were bodies that would appear to have been dead a long time, and there was no blood, right? There were bags of used passports found on the ground, intact. To me, this is a suggestion, or my inference is, that these were people who died at MH370,
right,
which has been lost.
How'd the passports get into a bag?
Exactly. So I think those people were taken off MH370. There's a high-value target on MH370, which were 20 members of the Freescale Semiconductor staff. I believe that's based in, or was based in, Austin, Texas. And those specialists were working on stealth technology with Freescale, which allows you to disappear a plane. My understanding from a technical point of view is if you hit or paint a plane with radar, if you have super fast technology inside the plane, it can take the input signal and turn it to 180 degrees and send it back to the the painting radar system and neutralize the return so the plane disappears. The essence I'm saying is, in each one of these mass casualty events that the public or the media want us to believe was the work of terrorists, very often there's a high-value target where they want to mask the murder of the high-value target with the mass casualty event. So if you go to Peter Gansey, he dies, but he's the fire chief of the fire department of New York, and he would be immensely valuable to appear as an expert witness, and he could explain to the American public exactly what was going on with the Motorola radio systems and the mayor's office of emergency management, and what the hell was going on in Chicago, because Motorola Solutions headquarters is in Chicago. If we take the Pentagon attack, Captain Gerald DeConto was the duty officer of the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center. He was on the phone, whether it's a secure phone or not is irrelevant, as I understand it, to the Secretary of the Navy, Gordon England, asking for permission to override the automatic lock on the missile battery on the roof of the Pentagon, which was treating the incoming weapons platform as friend, because it was transmitting a friend signal. And incidentally, friend or foe technology was invented by the British and implemented through a Ferranti box during World War II, and picked up, I believe, by folks like Raytheon. So now, if Gerald DeConto had survived, he could give you or Americans in general, a very precise description of what was happening to the upgrade of the Pentagon, Wedge 1, in the run-up to the 9/11 attack. And he would have been able to tell the public at large that one of the providers of the construction component of that project was an outfit called AMEC, which had offices above Starnet Communications at 425 Carroll Street in Vancouver. So my argument would be, it's highly likely that there are senior people at AMEC that have been targeted with this pedophile entrapment network by people like Jeffrey Epstein and Jimmy Savile. And then there's this extraordinary character called Carlton Bartels. Carlton Bartels had invented a carbon dioxide trading patent, CO2e.com, and he was on the 101st floor of the North Tower in the company of 657 of Cantor Fitzgerald colleagues, while the chief executive officer of Cantor Fitzgerald, a man called Howard Lutnick, who had an adjacent mansion to Jeffrey Epstein, and he was the inventor of interactive wagering on event outcomes. He was out of the office, allegedly taking his child to school. So Carlton Bartels and 657 of his colleagues, including the brother of Howard Lutnick, died. Right? And what intrigues me greatly is, does Christopher Hyman, the chief executive officer at the Serco, does he have an alibi for what I would argue is the possibility, I can't prove it because they've removed all the evidence, of someone walking up behind Carlton Bartels with a Glock and a silencer and putting a couple of bullets in the back of his head? And what I'm saying is, these people have such an exquisite sense of timing and organization and compartmentalized teams from different social networks that they can actually go into a crime scene and trigger a high-value target murder during a mass casualty event, where the public is expected to bite onto the mass casualty event, oh, that's terrible, 343 firefighters, and ignore the fact, the high possibility that Peter James Gansey Jr. was whacked with a Glock pistol outside the North Tower prior to the collapse of the North Tower. Over to you.
And of course, that's a hypothesis, a possibility. David, we've got a friend in the chat who is telling us that the Dutch-led investigation of MH17 is a complete joke, that it was dominated by Bellingcat, which this viewer says is tied to MI6. Do you know anything about Bellingcat?
No, I don't know about Bellingcat, but I can tell you that that crime scene was totally spoliated, and bodies went one way and debris went another way.
Sounds a lot like the Pentagon, David.
And Epstein in the cell. What I think we're nibbling on here, and hopefully we can convey that to the public. This is an incredibly exciting adventure that they can join us and help us help them to understand when they're being harassed or addressed with artificial reality messaging. Not my phrase. It's taken from that patent application.
What's the title of that
processed. It's a system for creating content on social networks, something like that. And you go into the text and it's got this phrase, artificial reality messaging and geo-reference data analysis. And my argument is that's something that is put in front of the people who have custody or have been outsourced for the operation of the United States Patent and Trademark Office, which incredibly, to this day, it's disgraceful, right, that the United States intelligence agencies and the President's cabinet have allowed the United States Patent and Trademark Office to be outsourced to this British company, Serco. Serco should be stripped out of every government contract in the United States. They represent, together with Amazon, for me, an existential threat to the survival of the Republic. Over to you.
Yeah, and it was just last week, David, that you and I were talking about that. I'm just looking for that brief interview with our friend Wilbur Ross, where he just didn't want to talk about it. We were talking about James Comey's notes to himself on our sponsor-only show last week, where James Comey had written that he'd been connected to President Donald Trump by the Crown switchboard, which seemed very odd and very connected to everything that you've been telling us about for so long. I think people will remember that it was almost a year ago, David, during the David Hawkins Christmas Spectacular, that we had special guest U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross join us, and he refused to answer questions about Serco. He wanted to talk about space. He likes space, David.
Well, he needs a lot of space, or he may need a lot of space. Epstein didn't have much space. It shrank around him. And but what intrigues me is the possibility that with the help of our public, if you will, we can peer into these very complex staged events, going back the phraseology of the City and Guilds of London Institute, going back to the 13th or 14th century. They used to stage miracle, mystery, or morality plays. by dragging a cart into a village or a town and having actors, and there would be trapdoors and fire eaters and pullers and all the rest of it, to create the impression in the public's mind that was largely illiterate back then of what goes on in terms of good and evil. Well, in a sense, and this is, I hope I'm not being patronizing, etc., the majority of politicians, I believe, are scientifically and technically illiterate, Jason. And it's a terrible thing, because I think a fundamental aspect of education is that children should be brought up understanding the impact potentially of technology on their minds. That is to say, they can be manipulated. Right? Well, you see these young people looking into cell phones, and they're getting a two-dimensional artificial reality messaging about how the world goes round. The real world does not go around like that. The real world is full of some very nice people and some psychopaths. Right? And the equipment on the Epstein Island apparently probably paralleled the equipment in the torture studios of Starnet at 425 Carroll Street. And there will be images buried in cyberspace, but more likely through the child base or the Internet Movie Database of Amazon, such that at any time they can pull out a significant number of people who they want to keep their mouths shut during or after one of these staged events, like the downing of MH17 or the destruction of the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center. I mean, Jason, think about it. Think about the strategic value of the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center on 9/11. This would be the link between the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, and the 9 or 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers around the world, including, as I understand it, one sailing in the Strait of Hormuz between Taiwan and the Chinese mainland. My impression is that if that fourth plane had hit the Capitol building and eliminated all of the congressmen and senators, then China would have attacked Taiwan, and the United States nuclear-powered aircraft carrier patrolling that area would have not been able to receive the commands from the President of the United States, who's been very carefully positioned, reading the story of the little goat. He's holding it upside down for a variety of reasons. Yeah. In that elementary school, that there are no coincidences, Jason. George Bush, who's a fighter pilot and quite a capable one, he was placed out of position during that exercise of 9/11, which I believe was an attempt at overthrowing the government of the United States. Over to you.
Well, I think, David, you've got a substantially higher opinion of, or rather perhaps you estimate his intelligence to be much higher than I do. I do not really care for George W. Bush at all, but I do want to bring together a number of topics that you've just mentioned in your last segment there. You're talking about education, you're talking about information hidden within images. David, tonight, I believe it's 7 p.m., we're still trying to zero in on a time. I'm going to be doing a very special show with a contributor to the show who's been on before, a Twitter user who goes by Luke Sly Talker and The Force. Luke and I have been working behind the scenes for the past 2 or 3 weeks examining some of the photos that have appeared in the New York Post, and Luke has identified a hidden PGP key that's been steganographically encoded into a photograph. So when you talk about things being encoded or images being hidden in IMDb or any other website, there are just almost limitless ways in which that can be done. You also mentioned education. You also mentioned the affinity that Mr. Ross has for space and wanting to talk about space. I want to remind people that the father of our current Attorney General, who also was the Attorney General under George H.W. Bush and was directly involved in pardoning some of the most sinister criminals who planned and executed the Iran-Contra scandal, Donald Barr, wrote a book called Space Relations, a science fiction book. Wow, $229 in paperback. That's absurd. He also wrote another book called A Planet in Arms, which you can get for $1,040.90. It's totally bizarre that's the situation, David. But this pertains to education because Mr. Barr, in addition to being a member of the OSS, as I understand it, was the headmaster at the Dalton School and left just immediately prior to Jeffrey Epstein beginning as a math teacher there at Dalton, despite never completing college, not having a master's degree in education. Epstein landed a job at one of the most, if not the most exclusive college prep schools here in Manhattan, loaded up with teenage girls, Jeffrey Epstein's favorite thing. And it's strange how all of these things are, even if loosely, connected.
Well, if you mentioned the OSS, the OSS came out of the Special Operations Executive, which was set up by Winston Churchill and Colin Gubbins, I think it was, to set Europe on fire, right? The Special Operations Executive gave birth to, if that's the appropriate word, to the OSS. At the end of World War II, Victor Rothschild was in Paris negotiating or discussing the transition from wartime to peace on behalf of Winston Churchill, if you will. And I believe he played a major role in setting up the CIA on the bones of the OSS. And again, I think what you've got here is 95 or 98% of the people in this alphabet soup of intelligence agencies, and poor Trump is beleaguered by having 18 intelligence agencies reporting to him, and I don't know how he can possibly filter out the truth from that. But you're going back to the 1990s. I don't know what year Epstein was at that school, but in 1991, Ghislaine Maxwell, after her father was probably whacked because he'd been stealing from the Daily Mail pension fund, the workers of the pension fund, and I think he was probably whacked by the worshipful company of stationers and newspaper makers. But anyway, she arrives in New York in 1991, and apparently, I would suggest, starts implementing probably the most sinister and effective method of infiltrating an enemy's intelligence agencies by entrapping their agents with young children, taking images and then blackmailing them to become double agents. And I would say that's the modus operandi of British intelligence, possibly for the last 150 years. Over to you.
Yeah, and you had mentioned that there was an uproar that Maxwell had flown to New York on Concorde. I've been unable to find that photograph despite looking. I also understand there is quite a degree of doubt and confusion surrounding Robert Maxwell's death, as there have been with Jeffrey Epstein as well. So it's interesting. And of course, we had that whole seemingly staged incident where Maxwell was seen at the In-N-Out Burger reading a book, the Book of Honor, CIA, the Secret Lives of CIA Operatives, Secret Lives and Deaths, whatever that was called. It's seemingly very obvious, and we're going to continue to dig in to some of that steganographic messaging and some of the weird stuff going on where In-N-Out Burger is being reported on by the New York Post. That's interesting. Well, anyway, so David, we're getting close to the end here, and is there anything else that you wanted to cover today?
Well, if you just wouldn't mind going back to the my reverse CSI scripts, and if I could just pick out some highlights of that, which I thought about very carefully. What I like is I was able to find this map of the all red line, which obviously has got a red line right through the British colonies, if you will. And there's a clock at the top and a clock at the bottom, which are quite interesting from the patent office point of view. The clock at the top, I think it was patented by Mr. Shepherd, and that's outside the Greenwich Maritime Museum. And the clock at the top straddles the meridian line, the East and Western Hemisphere. And that's, I think it's 1854 or something like that. The first subsea cable was laid from Ireland to Newfoundland in 1848. By the end of the 19th century, the colonies of the United Kingdom representing perhaps the greatest empire the world has ever seen and ever will see, was, and let me just use the phrase from this Financial Times FT weekend, right, dated Saturday, 31st of August of 2019, and the headline is "How a Company Builds an Empire," and this is the East India Company, EIC as it's known. A motley city gathering in 1599 was to morph into history's most rapacious corporation. William Dalrymple examines its rise and relevance. The East India Company remains our most ominous warning about the potential for corporate abuses. Now, that meeting was the 24th of September of 1599.
Wow.
Was the founding of the most rapacious corporate. Now, at that meeting, there were a whole variety of people, including the Lord Mayor of the City of London, and my grandfather, Bernard Frank Hawkins, was in the running to be, I believe, the mayor of the City of London way back in his day. But that meeting was attended by a number of people from the City and Guilds. It wasn't called the City and Guilds of London, but essentially that was driven. It was a mercantile operation where various corporations or livery companies from the City of London or guilds formed the earliest social networks that I would argue bedevil us today, because the worshipful company phrase came from these guilds, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, or whatever, worshipped each of them at a church in the City of London, hence the phrase worshipful company. But they were, if you will, the original social networks, and they're immensely more powerful today. And I believe Serco is the reincarnation of the East India Company. It's an incredibly dangerous, racketeering influence and corrupt organization. Sue me if you want, right? Remember, the chairman of Serco is Sir Roy Gardner, who is a fellow of the City and Guilds Institute of London. He's also a director of William Hill, which is the world's largest sportsbook operator that now controls 70% of the Nevada sportsbook industry, particularly accelerated after MGM Mandalay Bay was taken out of contention with that massacre at the Harvest Festival.
You know, we just did a show about that last night, David, talking about how John Cullen, one of the greatest investigators of the Las Vegas shooting, has discovered that the Las Vegas Review-Journal actually edited the footage captured by Corey Langdon, the cab driver who was the first to record audio of the shooting that seemed to indicate seemed to indicate gunfire both close and far away. What John has determined is that they cut out the appearance of helicopters in the footage. People can still see that on Crowdsource The Truth on YouTube from last night. This is some recent news about Roy Gardner just bought shares in Serco Group. He's the chairman of the board. So what does that mean?
Correct.
Insider transactions.
Depending on.
Oh, look at this! Look at the holding! Look at the holding, David.
You see, people should. I mean, I'm not patting our collective backs, but they should be joining us in droves, because this is a voyage of discovery, the like of which will never be repeated, right? Because we've been able. You have this background that stretches into Hollywood, and the brilliant camera work and manipulation of public perceptions. I have a technical background that takes me deep into the United States and the United Kingdom Patent and Trademark Office, where I can resurrect from those patent descriptions basically a fake news playlist, where I can create the perception using the technology where they want us to believe something happened. And I believe the common thread is they want to mask a high-value target hit, which could be JFK, except that wasn't a mass casualty event, with a mass casualty event where shock and awe is propagated through particular professions. So in the case of Carlton Bartels, that was 658 deaths of what I would call world traders, worship company of world traders. In the case of I believe, the contract killing of Peter James Gansey Jr., that's the mass killing of 343 firefighters by a social network connected to the City of London Worship Company of Firefighters. In the case of Captain Gerald DeConto in the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center, he would be a target for the Worship Company of Security Professionals, their social network. So this is, it's global, it's real time, but they have the ability to plant fake news playlists in the minds of the public. And you and I think, I'm being arrogant here, are uniquely qualified to reverse engineer those fake news playlists and share that with a global audience. And if we succeed in doing that, we change history. Over to you, Jason.
David, we've got some really aggressive morons in the chat who are obviously creating fake sock puppet accounts in real time to put trolling messages in here into the chat. I mean, simply saying that someone is saying something that's untrue is insufficient. A person will need to present some evidence to counteract the evidence that we present. I didn't put 33 in all these documents. It's a remarkable coincidence how frequently it shows up. I didn't edit the footage that the Las Vegas Review-Journal put online. They did. So if someone can explain why that was done 2 days after the shooting, I'm willing to hear that. But these troll messages, it's such a waste of time, David. It's part of the reason why you and I created the Patreon and Subscribestar only version of our show, which people can watch each week on Fridays. We normally begin at 1 p.m. Eastern, and I really want to encourage people who've been watching us today, perhaps you've seen David for the first time, please make your way over to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and sponsor David. Become a patron of David's Patreon page. You can see his daily posts there. You can watch the videos that David and I do together. Today's broadcast has been a special free preview for all of our viewers on YouTube, on Periscope, on Facebook, even for the trolling morons who want to create fake accounts to put stupid comments in there. Today was a day that they got to do that. If anyone is interested in seeing this very compelling video that we did last night with John Cullen, you can see how the Las Vegas Review-Journal has edited the video for no apparent purpose other than to remove visual evidence of helicopters that were flying without transponders. David, the information that you and I bring to the public is not popular among the group of individuals who own things like the Washington Post, the New York Post. New York Post is owned by Rupert Murdoch, good friend of the now deceased Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell owned the New York Daily News and several newspapers there in the United Kingdom. So it should be very obvious to people now that if you want to receive news from outlets that are giving you information that is paid for by billionaires who are trying to commit crimes, then that's fine. But if you like the information that David and I are discussing and you want access to it, it is critically important that you become sponsors of both patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth or subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. The other resource, David, that people can go to find out more information about your work and your resource is your fantastic free website, which people can get to by going to reversecsiscripts.com. David has created a link to a playlist of all the YouTube videos that we've done together so people can access those very easily. David, I want to thank you for another tremendous broadcast. Is there anything you'd like to say to everyone before we go for today?
Just one last thing about the relevance of that pair of binoculars
yes,
on my
of course.
website. I think that's a useful logo, if you will. I think I'm quite proud of it, because what I realized is they're watching us in real time as we watch them. So when you pop up above the parapet and start pointing out that I don't know, the fake bomb and hoax in the port of Charleston, you represent a threat to the fake news playlist that I believe
Yes.
primarily is driven by someone like Maureen Baginski. When I talk about that, for example, the asymmetric encryption, and Mr. Swigart, given that he's an ethical hacker and worked with or for the Air Force for a number of years, he should be, if he's a loyal, patriotic American, as opposed to, well, forget that, as opposed to someone who might want to distract people from investigating that asymmetric encryption, right? Remember, it was assigned to Boeing on the 4th of May of 2001, a few weeks before the full dress rehearsal of the attack of 9/11 called Amalgam Virgo, where the target for Amalgam Virgo exercise was the Capitol building for a captured or a hijacked plane, meaning they had complete knowledge of where the blue team would be vulnerable, possibly because they've got an instruction to stand down or knock it off at the end of the war game, and they could switch their red attack team from simulation to live fire, which is what happened on 9/11, where America nearly lost the right to continued existence through either negligence or malfeasance. Not quite sure which. Over to you.
Wow. Yeah. And everyone's memories are turning towards 9/11 as the anniversary approaches. It's hard to believe it's been 18 years. But David, thank you again for a wonderful broadcast. I want to thank all of our generous Patreon and Subscribestar sponsors. David does have a website, Pete. It's the website that we were just looking at. David's website is reversecsiscripts.com. I hope that people will visit that and visit David's Patreon channel at Reverse CSI Storyboards, patreon.com/reversecsi storyboards. And please become a sponsor of Crowdsource the Truth, patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. Got a couple more shows coming today, David, so I'm going to wish you farewell for now. We'll see you next Friday. Thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you, Jason. Bye for now.